I am here at the Finzel Swamp in Finzel, Maryland, and this is actually classified as what's known as a FEN, which is spelled F-E-N, and basically a fen is just a bog, except for the fact that it gets its water from a constant inflow from either a seep or a spring or a stream, instead of being filled with just rainwater that settles at the lowest point like a bog. So it's dominated by sphagnum moss, just like a bog would be, and pretty much everything else in a bog and a fen is the same, except for where it gets its water from. So we're going to be searching for the four-toed salamander, or Hemidactylium scutatum, because this species only breeds around sphagnum moss, because they have a very interesting egg development cycle, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but hopefully we're going to get a couple of these neat little salamanders. So here we have a bunch of sensitive fern, and I'm talking about this plant right here. They have a pretty interesting leaf structure. It's pretty smooth looking all around the entire plant, and most of the pinnae that come off of the sides are opposite of each other instead of alternate, which would mean that one would come here and then another one would pop out on top, but they're side by side on the rachis here. So the reason that they're called that is because after the first frost, all of the fronds die off until the next spring, and a lot of other plants, it takes a couple frosts if they're gonna go dormant to induce that. But for the sensitive fern, they're pretty sensitive, so they die off after the first frost. If you look really closely at the leaves, they have a pretty cool structure. So right here we have a Nerodia cypodon, or the northern water snake. It's a shame I didn't have my camera already filming, because there was like 4 basking right there and then they all went into the water at the same time. But they'll commonly be found around the water and pretty much any type of water. This here is a fen, like we said, but they'll be found near lakes, streams, rivers, all kinds of stuff. They're a pretty common largest snake of our area. This plant here is known as the royal fern, and it is really the only fern in the area that's going to have this really signature leaf shape with the ovals, and they're completely divided into their own pinnae. Or pinnules actually. So this is a pinnae on this, and then this is a pinnule right here, and they have that real smooth looking oval shape. But there's a lot of them where I'm standing right now, along with a lot of hay-scented fern. I haven't yet been able to locate a Hemidactylium scutatum, or the four-toed salamander. However, right here we have an Ambystomatidae, or Ambystoma maculatum. Now this is a very large mole salamander, and the Ambystomatidae is a family known as the mole salamanders because they actually spend most of their lives underground, except for the one night a year that they come above surface to breed in what's known as an ephemeral or a vernal pool. And to put that in simpler terms, it just means a temporary little pond. And they'll fill up with rainwater and snow melt during the early spring and early summer, and then after about mid to late summer they dry up. And the reason that these like to lay their eggs there is because there's no fish that are going to eat their babies and predate on them. So I'm gonna pick this guy up real quick just to show y'all how big they actually are, because it may be a little misleading on the camera, but This here is a big salamander. That's a lot bigger than any plethodontid is going to get in that family, the lungless salamanders. And these salamanders, in fact, do have lungs, being part of the mole salamander family. They're very different from the plethodontids that I've been showing in my videos up until this point. But I found this under this log here in a little burrow, and I'm pretty lucky to have seen one because, like I said, they're usually pretty deep underground until that one time a year that they do breed. So I'm gonna let this fella head back under that log where I found him and let him be on his way. Here we have a hatchling spotted salamander, or Ambystoma maculatum, like we just saw one of the adults. But this one just probably came out of metamorphosis and is now on land. And you can see this one's smaller than my finger, as the other one was bigger than my palm. This here is the gull species of the day. So this is known as, like I said before, Hemidactylium scutatum, or the four-toed salamander. And it's a very easy species to identify. I'll show a little more about that in a second. But I just want to talk a little bit about their breeding habits because it is so interesting. So like I said, these need to breed in sphagnum moss, which I'm actually going to show a patch of that after this clip so that you can see what it looks like. But sphagnum moss grows in strands upward, so it's like a bunch of columns of moss stacked next to each other, and they stay very moist all the time. And their eggs of this species, they cannot dry out completely, but they also cannot be laid in the water or they'll drown. But after they hatch, they are aquatic and they have gills, so they need water immediately after they hatch. So these salamanders lay their eggs in the top of the sphagnum moss where it's not submerged in water, but it's still wet. Then when the eggs hatch, they're able to wriggle down into the water below. And that's why they have to be found close to areas with sphagnum moss. Now what's even more interesting is sometimes the females that will stay back and guard their clutch of eggs are found with multiple clutches of eggs. Their eggs plus one or two more females' eggs. And the females that laid those extra clutches are nowhere to be found. And it was a very odd thing to scientists because they were like, well, there's no truly altruistic behavior in nature, meaning nothing does something just out of the goodness of its heart. And I know that's harsh to hear, but it's just science. So they figured out eventually that the eggs of this species are toxic. So the more eggs that a female has around her when she's guarding them in the bog, the better off she is because she's more protected. And the eggs, which I don't have to show right now because it's not their breeding season, but they're very white and they have a very signature look to them, which is easy for a predator to recognize, so they know to stay away. So if the female takes on other females' egg clutches who aren't able to stay in the bog because there's not much food in the bog and some females just don't have enough fat stores to stay there, they'll lay them next to another female and they'll happily take them on and guard them themselves. Now for a little bit of identification, this salamander has a black and white belly. So I'm gonna flip it around as best as I can. It's got like a salt and pepper pattern on the belly. And there's also a constriction at the base of the tail. You can see right there that they all have. And then the front of the face is also just very square looking. So these guys, this is a pretty small one actually. They get about maybe another half bigger than this, or a little bit bigger than that, maybe 3/4 bigger than this one. But it's a pretty small species of plethodontid, and they're a member of the plethodontid family again because they don't have lungs. They're the lungless salamanders. But the genus is Hemidactylium, and it's the only one in the area that belongs to that genus. So they're very neat little guys, and you can see their feet have those little teeny 4 toes. That's why they're called the four-toed salamander. But I'm very happy to see this salamander. And I'm gonna now move to a clip that's going to show you what the sphagnum moss looks like that they lay their eggs in. Now this here is a patch of sphagnum moss, and like we said, this is where those salamanders, the hemidactylium, like to lay their eggs. And you can see that when you pull out one piece, it's actually like a column. So this whole patch is just a bunch of these stacked next to each other. And the moss will die at the bottom because it doesn't get any more access to lay, and then it just grows up to the top. This stuff is actually really nice, and you can buy it as a medium for plants and things like that because it doesn't mold or anything, because it has a lot of antibacterial properties. And if you're in a survival situation, you can actually squeeze the water out of it like a sponge, and it has natural iodine inside of it, so it will actually be purified water. Now, I always recommend filtering your water through some sort of filter like a Life Straw or the Katahdin filter, but if you're in a real survival situation, this is going to be one of the next best things to that. Well, that was a really successful trip. We got our target species, and I definitely did not expect to see an Imbistomatid today, so that was pretty neat. But as you can see, I'm soaking wet, and it was pouring rain on me the whole time. Totally forgot to bring a raincoat today. That's my fault, but did that for you guys, so you get to see some cool stuff that you might not be able to find on your own. So until the next one, peace.